A year after Russia invaded Ukraine, it has seen serious setbacks. Ukraine is holding on, but the price is high. Many subsist in a landscape of craters and ruins. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been murdered, women raped, children deported. Over 8 million refugees have spread across Europe, more than half of them seeking shelter in EU countries. While Joe Biden became the first U.S. president in modern history to visit a war zone unprotected by U.S. troops, Russia's leader once again lashed out against the West and sought to prepare his people for protracted conflict and ongoing sacrifice. So we're asking, Ukraine, 1 year on, war without end, war without a winner? Hello and welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to greet our guests. Alexey Yusupov heads the Russian program at Germany's Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Markus Kaim is a senior fellow in the Security Policy Division at the German think tank SWP. And my colleague Xenia Polska is originally from Ukraine and works in DW's Brussels bureau. And Xenia, let me begin by asking you what's uppermost in your mind as we mark this first anniversary of the Russian invasion?
I am very worried. As a Ukrainian, I am just worried that the suffering is going to continue and that there will not be enough help in order to counter further aggression coming from Russia. And there are people who are saying Ukraine will win, it's inevitable. And I know that it sounds very good, but it's too early to say that because nobody knows how this war will end and when it will end.
I know that you told me you actually did expect that Russia would invade. What were your feelings when you woke up that morning and heard that, in fact, it was happening?
I expected it when, at the press conference with Olaf Scholz, Putin mentioned the word genocide. For me, it was clear that something was wrong, and combined with the troops on the border, it's like 1 + 2, I was able to calculate it. But being a Ukrainian, I did not want to accept the reality, and I was hoping that I was wrong. So on the day that it happened, I had to, do a seminar, was preparing for it, was looking forward to it. But after several minutes of the seminar, it was online. So I could crawl on the couch, and I found myself on the couch crying for hours, shaking, and thinking about the black hole that has torn itself open. It's a black hole to the worst human atrocities that we can imagine. It's a gateway to the worst things a human being can commit in this world. And I felt all that at that moment without really knowing what was going to happen.
Alexey, Vladimir Putin has claimed from the outset that he launched this invasion in order to unite Ukrainians and Russians who are a single people. Hasn't this war done far more to divide than to unite?
Well, at least it's safe to say that the Russian aggression probably has sped up the creation of a Ukrainian modern political nation. I think there are some polls recently that are showing that people who identify themselves as Ukrainian politically have been increasing steadily over the last years, but after the aggression, they're way up the 90% lines. And so Vladimir Putin actually, even if there was any question, I don't think there was any question about the existence of a Ukrainian nation, which is completely separate from the Russian one. But even if there was a chance to pose this question, Vladimir Putin has ended this discussion. He has put a big fat dot and said, well, the aggression gives those who have led lives of intertwined and mixed backgrounds, language-wise, identity-wise, economically, gave them a very clear emotional stimulus to understand themselves as Ukrainians and not as
But on the Russian side, if I listen to some of the sound bites that we heard from people leaving the big celebratory concert that was held this week in Moscow, Russians, they seem to continue to believe the propaganda about being one people.
You see, the one thing we need to understand about the Russian state propaganda is that it operates in a very smart mode of conduct. And this is the big difference to the dictatorship of the 20th century. We are used to having an authoritarian regime. It defines a new truth, which is very often not connected to reality, and then it's hammered down the throats of the people who consume the propaganda. In Russia, it's a little bit different. You have everything on the board. If you're a communist, then this war is about beating back the hyper-capitalist American imperialism. If you're a Russian chauvinist, then this is your soundbite of saying, look, finally the peoples of Kyiv or Rus are reunited under the leadership of Moscow. If you're a person who tends to think in geopolitical terms, you don't really care about Ukraine. It's about a rebirth of Russia as a superpower. Mm-hmm. If you're an esoteric person, you will have other arguments again. So what we see in the TV is just one offer to keep a certain percentage of the Russian population satisfied. Mm-hmm. All of the things contradict each other. That's not a problem. This is made on purpose. Mm-hmm.
Markus, let's switch to the West. How would you say that the war has changed, if at all, Europe, the US, Germany?
What I found most interesting and, to be honest, most surprising was during the last year the clear commitment of the United States for European security. They have returned as a last provider of European security. I mean, return is not the proper word. They have not been totally away. But, I mean, we have to keep in mind what have been the key signals of the first year of the foreign policy of the Biden administration. The first sign or the first paradigm, to put it this way, was our priority is the Indo-Pacific. It's about China, China, China. And the second paradigm, to put it this way, was U.S. foreign policy for the middle class. So the whole U.S. foreign policy is more conditional. It's not given. It's not a given anymore. The classical U.S. internationalist role. And given this background, I think it could not really be expected that the United States would play such a clear role, would follow these commitments regarding European security. And I mean, it's quite substantial. 20,000 soldiers having been deployed more to Europe. As far as I remember, $80 billion of help for the Ukraine, financial aid, humanitarian aid, military aid. This is quite something.
Let me just ask you to look at the other side now. Europe, Germany, have they also been changed?
In a way, in a complementary way. I think, I mean, in particular, Germany has, since the 1960s, always been torn with its security policy between the European orientation and the transatlantic orientation. And I think this has been decided for the foreseeable future. The United States has presented itself as the last provider of security for in Europe. And the European Union has never managed, despite all efforts, to develop into a credible, effective security provider in Europe. And therefore, what I see is a transatlantic shift of German security and defense policy, which I never would have expected and which I cannot remember for the last, let's say, 20, 30 years.
And we're going to later on dig a bit deeper into whether that can last. Let us first, however, look at the high price that Ukraine has paid over the past year. Villages and cities have been reduced to ash and rubble. Thousands of civilians have been wounded or killed, millions displaced, and yet many go on trying to preserve a semblance of normality.
A kindergarten in Kramatorsk, an apartment building in Kharkiv, a clinic in Kherson. All targets of Russian attacks. I know there's a chance I might die. Last night a shell flew into my garden. All the windows were blown out. A bullet flew into my house this morning. It could have hit me in the head. I live in the ruins with no water, no light. We need peace. It's essential. Air raid sirens in Kyiv. War is part of everyday life, even far away from the front lines. People shelter in bunkers or subway stations, places that not only provide refuge but also serve as classrooms. This is also the new normal. It's not that comfortable for the children, but there have been so many alarms since September, so they've gotten used to this kind of school. Glory to the heroes, sings the crowd. War is also pervasive in this club in Kyiv. This is the link between war and peaceful life. It allows us to switch off for a moment and remember what life was like before war and what it will be like after our victory. What is the war doing to Ukrainian society?
And let me pass that question straight over to Xenia. What are you hearing from friends and family in Ukraine? What is the war doing to Ukrainian society?
Many people are extremely tired. They are exhausted. They are reluctant to hide themselves from, attacks even, because the sirens sound so often that sometimes they just want to go on with, whatever daily business they have, because they say, I have a list of things to do today. Or they cannot really continue their work because there is no electricity, there is no light. So they cannot give classes online, they cannot make phone calls over, messengers and so on. So some of them try to escape in, whoever can work and escape into their work and just continue as if it were normal life, going to sports, doing manicures, But of course, you can see that all the people want, it's a common desire. For any anniversary, for any birthday, any New Year, the only thing people wish is to have peace. But they don't want peace at any price. They say, we want this to be over with a victory that would be ours.
Alexey, let me return to Putin's claim that the war is about uniting two people. How much compassion do Russians actually feel for their Ukrainian brethren? How much do they know about the daily lives of those in Ukraine?
I think they know quite little. It's safe to say that the war has also marked separation of the informational spaces and realms. It's very, very hard for, even if you're interested, if you're a politicized Russian citizen, maybe even critical of the government or the regime, it's very hard for you to come by and to get access to the same informational stream as we consume here. A good example is if you say the word Bucha, everyone knows. In Germany, in Ukraine, obviously, but also in Europe, everyone knows what it is.
Where the war crimes
exactly.
were committed.
The whole world, I think.
Exactly. So it's clear it's connected to the atrocities, but the Russian troops, the pictures are there and so on. If you say the word Bucha in Russia, it's not that some people would deny anything happened, but many people would just say, doesn't really ring a bell. There was something, but I'm not sure. And this shows you that the informational space and the agenda is controlled by the Russian government in a completely different way. And when it comes to compassion, there are even people in Russia who would say that they have a lot of compassion with Ukraine. But, and I'm coming back to this buffet of propaganda narratives, one of them is that this is a defense war. It's a defensive operation. Sure, it's preemptive, but it claims that if Russia wouldn't have struck first, it would have been target of the attack. Obviously, this is bogus, but for people, it's easy to combine their general compassionate and maybe even pacifist outlook with the necessities of the big politics and saying, it's bad, people are suffering, but this is what war means, and it had to be done. So it's very important to see who are you actually looking at. The society is very fragmented. There is no access to free information. And in general, there is also this idea that it's about politics. And between people, we'll come by. And so, fortunately, we don't see a genuine societal anti-Ukrainian sentiment among normal population yet. It might come because the government might want to start to fuel it. But at the moment, I wouldn't say this is the case.
Xenia, Vladimir Putin recently but constantly refers to Russia within its historic borders, that being one of his rationales for the invasion. Isn't this war ultimately perhaps more about Russian imperialism than about Russian brotherliness?
Definitely, because we don't see any foundation to his claims. What is he talking about when he refers to the Russian Empire? Or what is he talking about when he says that Ukraine is ruled by Nazis? You know, one of the favorite narratives of Russian propaganda. Of course, it has no real claims because Ukraine has its borders. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state that has had its borders since 1991. And Ukraine also gave up their power to protect themselves, to gain the sovereignty when they just gave up their nuclear weapons. So Ukraine sacrificed a lot for the independence. Ukraine, of course, had its phases as a young state, but Ukraine has always, since then, been a sovereign, independent state with its own path, with its own ambitions, and so on. So, of course, these claims mean nothing.
Markus, it's not only Russia that has been accused of reverting to imperialist stereotypes. In fact, Germany's hesitation and ambivalence that it has shown at various times over the past year in terms of supporting Ukraine has been very fiercely criticized by some as a holdover of German imperialist or neo-colonial attitudes.
I think that has nothing to do with imperialism. I think it has to do more with realism and get used to the changed geopolitical environment we're confronted with. This has been at the core of the so-called Zeitenwende, the turning point of German foreign and security policy during the last year. And I think we have seen the signs over the last, let's say, 10 years. Emerging new world order characterized by multipolarity and geopolitics. And some European partners have realized this way before us. I think of Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and other countries as well. And so Germany is simply adjusting to this new reality. And one illustration is the speed with which certain political paradigms of German foreign securities, which hold true for 30 years, have gone out of the window. For example, that you can only create European security together with Russia. Nobody would claim this anymore. Now it's about creating or sustaining European security without Russia or against Russia. And this is only one example for this, let's call it paradigm shift of foreign and security policy of Germany.
Xenia, with all this suffering and the existential danger that Ukrainians face, do they still have the energy and the will to tackle challenges like corruption, essentially restoring and renewing political institutions, which clearly would be prerequisites for them ever to be admitted to the EU?
Exactly, and I would say absolutely, because one thing is, that any day you could die. And this is the reality that Ukrainians are living in. Nobody is safe. You can die anytime, any day, anywhere, if you are within the territory. But at the same time, they have a perspective. And this is very important because in hard, black, dark times like this, you need to think about the future. And the European Union gave them this new perspective, something to look forward to. And of course, the prerequisites are very tough and they have to be completed in order even, for Ukraine to be revised as a candidate. So they're very determined. And I think there is a lot of not only the politicians who have to deliver because they will be asked by the European counterparts or the EU counterparts, but the societal pressure is growing because the society really wants to see the results and they want to be part of the EU and they want to have negotiations even within this year. So.
Meanwhile, Alexey, societal pressure is not growing in regard to Vladimir Putin, at least societal opposition not. How strong is his hold on people 1 year on?
I think it's quite substantial. I also think that the unpleasant truth is that for an autocracy like Russia is, it's quite a pleasant mode of conduct to be in a war, in a limited war. Because, your opposition, your dissidents are either in jail or frightened, or out of the country. You have this whole mobilization narrative saying, look, this is an existential thing, let's pull together our forces. And at the same time, the elites are so far quite unified behind Vladimir Putin because there is no viable alternative for them And there is no clear picture of the future. And it's interesting if you listen to his speeches, which is a complicated task to do, but I'm getting paid for it, so I do that. He tries to paint an image of the future where there is no end to this war. This is where it really gets Orwellian. This hasn't been the case last year, but if you listen to him, he doesn't mention any war goals. He just says the economy will be stable, we'll help the teachers, we'll help the refugees, there will be additional leave for the soldiers coming back, all the small instruments saying, don't worry about the big picture, life will be good, without spelling out how this war ends. And this means his hold on power is actually quite good.
Let's dive deeper on that very point. Both Putin and Joe Biden took the approaching anniversary of the Russian invasion to send some key messages and prepare their listeners for protracted conflict.
The responsibility for the Ukraine conflict, for its escalations, and for the rising number of victims lies solely with the Western elites, and with the current regime in Kyiv, to which the Ukrainian people are basically strangers.
1 year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power, but there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire.
Let me go straight to Markus and ask you about the end of that statement from Biden. He says our support will not waver, but reportedly the Biden administration has told Kyiv that it could waver, especially if Republicans won the next election. What do you think? Will that happen? Not the election, but will the support waver?
I think it's fair to say that the war has entered a new phase, or is about to enter a new phase. We see it as louder voices, or voices in the US becoming more vocal about not supporting the Ukraine indefinitely. We see Chinese efforts, maybe not to end the war, but to provide some kind of mediation. And I wouldn't bet on the political landscape in Europe. I mean, we have elections in the next couple of years or months and years in several European countries. And so far, the immediate effects of the war on European economies have been quite mitigated. Therefore, I could imagine a scenario 2 years from now in which the support for Ukraine will be waning, and that will change totally the picture.
Alexey, Putin, in his speech, appeared to be offering material incentives to Russians who keep the conscripts coming. What effect do you think that will have? Is he essentially buying off families who sacrifice their sons?
He does, but you also have to see the Russian economy has performed historically not bad in the last 20 years under Putin, but it hasn't ended poverty in Russia. And in some respect, you could also claim that in peripheral regions, the material level of life of people has gone down. The war, and this is another unpleasant truth, a war is a social elevator. It gives people opportunities to earn money and to advance, at least in their minds, their material well-being for their families. So it's not necessarily just buying off families who are grieving, it's actually offering some people a way out of their material situation. And this is unpleasant, but this is the case.
It's often said that who wins a war depends very much on hearts and minds. So you're telling us that Russian hearts and minds are still absolutely with Putin in this war?
That's not what I'm saying, but most of the Russians are not for this war and for Putin, but most of the Russians are not against the war, and this is the bigger political problem. It's a depoliticized, amorphic society, and we need to take this into consideration.
Xenia, Joe Biden delivered the speech that we heard that clip from in Poland after having made a very unusual, astonishing trip to Kyiv. In fact, the first time in memory that an American president has traveled to an active war zone where there are no U.S. soldiers to support him. How much did that mean to people in Ukraine? How much do they believe that Western support will remain with them?
Well, they have no choice. Of course, it was, I think it was very encouraging to see him because he also risked his life because he was there. Of course, there are shelters everywhere where he could have been, where he could have been hiding, but he didn't want that, obviously. Anyway, they saw that he took this major risk, and it was a huge support for them in this time where they're seeing that Russia is mobilizing more troops, Russia is throwing more weapons, more money into the game. But Ukrainians simply have no choice. They have to keep negotiating, keep cooperating with the West in order to get what they need, in order to get enough to stop this.
Our title asked, "A war without end, war without a winner." How well prepared are Ukrainians for this situation to continue?
If the West stands with them, and if China doesn't start sending weapons to Russia, as the speculations are, then there's a good chance that Ukraine would close this black hole that I was talking about.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us, and thanks to all of you who are watching us. Do check out our YouTube channel and tell us what you think about this program.